Hey everyone, it's Matt, and this is another edition of Tether Talks. We're just going to wait for Andrew Reiner to join us. It's going to be a really great conversation today. Andrew is the author of a new book that's coming out that I'm going to let him share about. And this book is on masculinity and raising better boys, and I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation for all of us. We just need to give Andrew a moment to join us. Here he is, and I'm going to. There we go. We're going to go live now. Andrew Reiner. There we go, Andrew.
Hey Matt, how you doing?
Oh, I'm good, sir. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
I'm really excited to have you on. This is going to be a really fun conversation. So first off, we're here live with Andrew Reiner, who is an author of a book that's coming out. I'm going to let him introduce the book and tell everyone what it's about. There it is, Better Boys, Better Men. And I'm glad you brought a copy, and I'm going to be expecting my copy coming in the mail in the next few weeks. I'm sure it's going to be
Of course.
on my desk. And this is, and so, I mean, you've been studying the topic of masculinities, and you know, we talk a lot about this sort of hidden crisis that's going on with respect to men's mental health. There's a male suicide epidemic. You've dug into this like a lot, right? This is kind of your bread and butter right now, and I'd love to just hear the story about your own journey, even with with your own masculinity, how that maybe pushed you to wanting to write a book like Better Boys, Better Men. Tell us a bit of the story behind yourself and the book that's coming out.
Sure. So, it starts, of course, you mentioned masculinity, and that's, of course, where it starts, right? So, in my case, all of this really kind of indirectly got onto my own radar when I was about 7 or 8 years old, and I got into this really brutal fist fight with this kid in the neighborhood. It was, in my neighborhood, when kids got into little brawls, they literally ended in a few minutes. You kind of, shook hands and you went back to playing together. This was not one of those fights. This was the kind of fight that fortunately nobody ever saw again in the neighborhood after this one, but it was brutal.
Mm-hmm.
Went on a long time, and this kid was just pummeling me, and he wouldn't stop. At one point he even, pulled this thing where he said, get on your knees and beg for mercy. I did that, and he still kept hitting me. I tried running away. He caught up to me, started hitting me again. The whole neighborhood turns out for this. I mean, it was just the entire neighborhood was just watching this spectacle, because that's really what it was. So what I expected after that was to come home, to get some compassion from everybody in my family, to get some, maybe not empathy, but definitely some compassion, maybe a little nurturing. I was 7, 8 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So I hear my brother, my oldest brother, yelling at my mother in the kitchen. They don't see me because I came in through the back door. And he's screaming. And he is telling her what a disgrace I am to the family, what a black sheep I am, what a coward I am. And that was really the beginning, really from that point on, really of a smear campaign. My brother did that with my sister in a different way, and he did it with me. And so what happened for me after that was I kept fighting. I kept getting into fights at school, not as much in the neighborhood, but I got into a lot of fist fights at school. And at some point, and really, so what was going on, I didn't realize till many, many years later, is that really I was literally and figuratively just trying to fight my way out of the shame.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that all boys and men at some point in their lives can identify with. The shaming process that begins because you did something where you fell short in the eyes of some other boy or man.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's very much what happened for me. And so I thought fighting my way out of that box, was the answer. And when I was in, I think it was 6th grade, I got into a fight with a kid who ended up becoming a very close friend of mine afterwards. And about halfway into the fight, I just couldn't do it. I just felt like, you know what, this is just, not only is this wrong, but I don't want to hit this kid We got into a fight. I don't remember exactly why it was, but I remember thinking to myself, we're fighting for a really stupid reason.
Mm.
And so after that, I stopped fighting. And unbeknownst to me, there was just kind of a consciousness shift after that when I put my fist down. And just things started becoming much more apparent to me. You know, because I stopped fighting, because I was no longer, you know, in that kind of combative mode, my eyes and my ears were much more open to the things I was seeing around me in the way that other boys were treating each other. And so I went
Mm-hmm.
through, you know, the rest of my education after that, just being more and more attuned to really what was going on in the way that boys and eventually men were treating boys, the way that we were treating each other. And so that started to really shift things for me. And so by the time I guess, I was finishing high school, I was kind of at a place in my life where I felt like I was ready to start pushing back on some of this kind of script that was being handed down to us. And so, you know, that continues really throughout my adulthood. But with the birth of my son who's now 9 years old, with the birth of my son, it really felt like just a pail of cold water in my face. Because up until that point, it had been kind of a consciousness raising for me. You know, I'd been on my own path. You know, I had my own story, my own narrative that I was following, where I was pushing back against a lot of the hypermasculinity that I thought was wrong. So it meant that, you know, if a guy would say to me when we were out, you know, have another beer, you know, have another beer, have a shot. What's your problem? Can't you hold your own?
Yeah.
Well, I had no problem standing up for myself in a situation like that and coming back and saying, look, man, I don't need to like prove my identity to you by
Yeah.
what or how much I'm drinking. And, you know, and then there were other times where maybe I would step into a situation between, you know, a guy and a woman where maybe they were arguing, and I'd say something like, you know, where it looked like he was mistreating her. And I'd say, look, hey, are we okay here? Is everything cool? So it was kind of my own path. But then when my son was born, it really became this kind of reckoning moment where it's a matter of, okay, so this has been my trajectory. And I've had my own kind of fight with hypermasculinity that I've been able to push back against. But now that I've got a son, suddenly all of this is going to be beginning again for him, and to a large extent for me as well, because it's clearly on my radar now.
Mm-hmm.
And so what is this going to look like? You know, what is this going to look like? Because I am now the inheritor of a boy, of a male. And so what does that mean in terms, how is my own story and my own path going to influence and, you know, and intersect with his? Well, clearly as a father, you know, and as a parent, period, you are a role model. But it's different for girls and women. You know, women don't have that same expectation of saying, well, I've got a girl that I have to raise, and so all these expectations are going to be heaped on her and heaped on me. That's not the same experience as it is for boys and for men.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was what I was wrestling with. And then it was also the idea of, you know, I was very nurturing and very loving in the house, and I wanted to be that way outside of the house. But I also wanted to raise my son in a way that I wasn't also going to set him up for potential bullying outside of the house. That's
Right.
very complex, because if I'm raising my son one way in the house and then he has to go out into the world and he's meeting with very different expectations, you know, am I helping or hurting him? And so it's been a real complex kind of dance in terms of figuring out what it is I need to be for him and who I need to be for him. And so really, I guess really, Matt, it really begins with when he's born, because I just felt this compulsion to really start writing a lot of pieces and really leaning into this topic in a much more kind of with an urgency that I just hadn't felt before. And then the book really grew out of some of the articles that I've done.
Yeah, and I've read a number of the articles that you've written on the subject, and they're
Thank you.
fantastic. And one of the things that one of the things that's kind of been bred into me through doing this work, and I mean, we could go in a number of different directions, and it's interesting because like even after deciding to put your fist down, just this idea that you would, say, I don't need to measure myself by your standards, or getting in the way of, getting in the middle of, potential conflicts between, men and women, where it looked like the man was mistreating the woman. I mean, that's still that fighter instinct, right? Like
Absolutely.
you didn't remove yourself from the fighter instinct. It just had matured, and there was more of a warrior aspect to it, where it's like you're getting into it, but it's like the Zen warrior, where you're not engaging physically, but you're using your presence and your words to dismantle the situation, as opposed to using your fists, which is it's really interesting, because as soon as you said that, I was like, yeah, but the fighter is still in there, right? Like otherwise,
Yeah.
you just wouldn't have engaged at all. But one of the things that we talk about a lot, and one of the things that's really been bred into me since beginning doing men's work, and we can talk a little bit about my journey and that as well too. But what's been really interesting is this concept of the soft front but the strong back. And I've thought a lot too about, like, if I was blessed with a son, how would I raise that boy, knowing that I was bullied, and tormented as a child.
Yep.
But then also wanting him to grow up and be the man that is emotionally responsive, receptive, caring, and all of that kind of stuff. But then also giving him the message, but if somebody comes after you, you're allowed to punch them in the face. You know what I mean? Like, you're allowed to defend yourself. And I think,
Right.
like, and I wonder, it's like, how you've already now gone through this with a 9-year-old boy. How have you sort of modeled and messaged that? And it sounds like it's an evolving and complex thing, but how have you attacked that piece so far?
So, yeah, I mean, yeah, and you're right. It has been very complex, and it will continue to be, because he's really at an age now where, the era he's growing up in is very different, and in a lot of really good ways. So, boys aren't, fortunately, a lot of boys. I'm not saying all boys, because of course, unfortunately, a lot of boys are, but I don't think as many boys are growing up in environments where they're expected to fight at a young age. And I think that's progress. And that said, my son is very much like me in that he is very physical. He can be very assertive, and he has a lot of questions, which is great. And so the questions he's often asked me is, well, when am I supposed to? Am I supposed to, and when am I supposed to ever, throw a punch? Which he's never had to, which has been great. But it's very much what you said. It's that idea that if you encounter somebody who is, who is taunting you, who is tormenting you, who is maybe even bullying you, and you cannot remove yourself from the situation without them following you and still taunting you and maybe even threatening you with physical force or pushing you or doing something, look for the helpers, which was always a great line from Mr. Rogers. Look for the helpers, look for the adults that you think can be helpers. And if that person cannot help you, or nobody is around, you should always use your words first and say, look, I'm not okay with this. You're crossing a line. Please stop. And if that person continues to do it, you say the same thing again. Please stop. I am not okay with this. And you physically, again, keep trying to remove yourself. And I said to him, if this person continues to follow you and to threaten you with physical violence, then go for it. Do what you've got to do, because I don't, and it's not, I'm not like a lot of fathers who are afraid of their sons being bullied and being a doormat. That's not my concern with my son. My concern for having a son is I don't want him to have to be on the receiving end of physical harm when he can prevent it, and when he has not provoked it. You know, to me, it's all about defense. It's all about strictly defense. It's not about going on the offense. It's about being on the defense. And that's pretty much, you know, when I think about my own past, and there's been times where where I may not have, I haven't used my fist as an adult, but I definitely have used my voice. You know, it's always been on the defense. It's never been on the offense. And I do think that there are ways that boys can be taught to, in possibly clear terms, that you can try to teach them when it is okay to throw a punch, and that it's not something you want to go looking for, and then it's not something that should be the first response when someone is taunting you. I do think that there are ways that we should teach boys of leaning into their words, drawing boundaries with words, making that very clear that they mean business. But then if somebody is not going to stop and there are no helpers around that can help or that will help, you know, then for the sake of self-defense, it's okay to do that.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting, and I think like empowering a young boy to take matters into their own hands, because one of the things that I think happened with me in my childhood was I was never actually given permission by an adult to fight back, right? Like neither one of my parents said, if this is happening and there's no adults around, feel free to punch that guy in the face, right? And we'll deal with it deal with it when you get home. And if you get kicked out of school, don't worry about it. You're gonna live another day. We'll get you into school. It's not gonna be the end of the world. And that is something that has followed me through my whole life, where it's like in some ways I've become a people pleaser because I've had to learn as an adult that strong back where I say to people, no, I'm not okay with this and you can't do that, right? But what I learned is that I had to appease people in order for them to not bully me, or I had to appease people in order for them to like me. And in a lot of ways, I think that is just as damaging as telling a kid, you know, I think it's more damaging, honestly, than to tell a kid that he can go punch somebody in the face, right? Like I wish somebody had told me to punch someone in the face at some point. And so I understand you have this, like, you know, say, I'm not okay with this, please stop. There's an escalation process to that. But I think it is important to empower young boys to take care of themselves, and that it's not all just about saying, you know, this is the way that you're making me feel or whatever, but giving them the power to defend themselves if they actually do need to.
Yeah, I do agree with that, Matt. And to me, it's a last resort. You know, it's like when my son, when we've taken our you know, when my wife and I have taken our son to do karate, one of the messages that we really love, you know, that the head teacher, you know, that he imparts, is that this is always like a last resort. You don't lead with this. This is a last resort. And let me just say this. One of the things I really do wrestle with is the idea that boys should have to feel that if they do have to throw punches to defend themselves, that there is something really that is very affirming for them in terms of their manhood. Mm-hmm. That I think is a problem. That I still think is a problem with this idea of masculinity. Mm-hmm. The idea that if you are willing to throw a punch and you feel like you need to throw a punch, that therefore you are still, you know, you're going to a place that will still make you feel like, well, at least I threw a punch. At least I did this, and now I can still walk away feeling like a man. Because one of the things in my book that I really appreciated in men who I talked to who had violently passed was that quite a few of them would say, I'm at the point now, and unfortunately it took a lot of suffering and a lot of pain in addition to being incarcerated for them to learn this, but it's that you can walk away from something and still feel like your masculinity is intact, even though you didn't throw a punch. And that really, to me, is what we should be aiming for, because I know that, you know, it's easier for a man who has lived through that and sees the other side of violence to be able to say, well, I don't need that anymore. I don't need to prove myself.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of us would say, well, yeah, you're badass. You proved yourself, so you don't have to throw punches anymore. That's what I have a problem with. I don't think masculinity should have to still be rooted in some of that very old, I think very dysfunctional mindset that if you can still pull a trigger or throw a punch, you can still have your man card stamped. Because if you're willing to go to that extreme to prove to yourself and to other guys, then therefore you should feel like you have been vindicated.
Right.
I would say I would maintain the only time a boy should ever have to go to that extreme is literally for self-defense, is literally to do that.
Right.
I don't see a problem. I really don't see a problem with boys learning how to de-escalate through language. And I don't think that walking away from a situation that could have gotten worse, if you can de-escalate with language, I don't think your masculinity has been compromised at all. I really don't.
Agree. Totally agree. Yeah.
So
yeah.
Again, my feeling is it's self-defense. And I really have I've gotten to a point where I really have an issue with boys or young men especially feeling like, well, if I can throw a punch, then I've vindicated myself. I feel like it shouldn't have to be that because, for instance, women don't have to do that.
No.
Women don't have to walk away and feel like my gender identity, i.e. my identity, is in question because I did not slap that other woman. Women don't walk away. Most women don't walk away feeling that. And I don't feel at this stage of the game that boys or men should have to feel that either.
Absolutely. And for women, it's like their womanhood, it's very much dependent on other things as well, right? And they're feeling the attack of their womanhood has to do with, different aspects of personality. But I totally agree with you. Or different aspects of, what they go through as well, right? Like specifically the ability to have children can be a huge impact on a woman's feeling of their own femininity, right? So, but I want to use that as like a really interesting segue into the problem in and of itself. And we talk a lot about this, but you've dug into this extraordinarily deeply, right? And I think we kind of it was an interesting sidetrack down because the physical fighting is such an interesting representation of all of this. But like, what's kind of like, in your opinion, what's the origin of this and how has it been, I guess, consistently passed down over and over and over again? What's been the problem and why is it still persisting today? And what are you seeing in terms of some of the shifts maybe societally and from a gender identity perspective that are heartening to you right now?
Yeah, so I think that well, let me ask you just to clarify, Matt. When you say that the origins of this, are you talking about just kind of like the masculine script, the traditional norms?
Yeah, the archetype that we all get born with. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, here's the thing. I mean, when you look across all cultures, there are variations of this, right? I mean, there always have been. There are variations in this. It's not a coincidence, that all cultures historically have had rites of passage for boys, right? Mm-hmm. They've had rites of passage. This was a way, of course, and we don't need the long-winded story, but it's basically, this is a way that the men and the elders felt, okay, we can impart this on you, so you now know what it means to be a male and eventually a man in our society. This is what we expect of you. That's basically what that was. And so there are common threads that have always permeated all cultures about like kind of certain masculine expectations. Mm-hmm. And of course, there also are variations. For instance, when we look at Mediterranean cultures, when you look at, for instance, especially when you go to parts of Italy, especially southern Italy and Greece, even parts of Spain, it's much more normal, for men to cry and to be very emotive, and for people not to be looking askance when they're walking down the street, or to see men hugging each other openly and with gusto. I mean, that's just part of the culture. And yet there also are parts of that culture that we would recognize in terms of masculine expectations. You know, certain things such as taking care of the family, the expectation of that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the expectation of, raising a boy, toughening up a boy in certain ways. These are all kind of common threads that go across all cultures. So, you know, since time immemorial, there have been rites of passage in all cultures. And that's really diminished. You know, it's really been diminished a lot in Western cultures over the past, really since the Industrial Revolution. You know, when you look back about, to like maybe the mid to late 19th century in a lot of Western cultures, that's where you start to get a lot of boys and young men, leaving the farms. And so once that happens and they're going into the cities, there's that disconnect with the villages and the small towns that they're coming from, where they had this kind of nucleus of men, whether it was fathers or uncles or grandfathers or just other men who were kind of bringing them along informally and teaching them.
Right.
So that was a form of rites of passage. So, we've gotten disconnected from that over the past 150 or so years. In terms of what's going on today, I feel like in some ways we're kind of stepping backwards. I really do. And in some ways I feel like we are moving forward. So the ways I feel like we've been stepping backwards is I feel like, we look at the pop culture that we all consume. And we know that pop culture is a really important form of our identities, right? We both, we consume pop culture that reflects back how we want to see ourselves. And we look for ways that we aspire to be in the pop culture we consume as well. It's this kind of fluid mirror.
Right.
And a lot of the pop culture that a lot of younger guys consume really is very hypermasculine today. When you look at a lot of the gaming, when you look at a lot of the action hero, franchises that are just absolutely huge, there's a lot of really kind of hypermasculinity that's really being espoused and that's being modeled in these places. And we can even put we can put gaming aside. I mean, because that's kind of a lot of that's over the top. But even if you look at a lot of these action hero movies that a lot of guys love and they consume like crazy, I mean, these are action hero characters that are always, it's like it's like a form of combat in action. These guys are men of action. They're doers. They're not talkers, right? There's that.
Yeah.
These guys always are. They're very pithy. They've always got a smart ass comeback. And these are guys who may wrestle with their inner moral compass a little bit, and there's like, a little bit of that going on. But these are not guys who are hanging out supporting each other emotionally.
Of course not.
There is not that emotional support being modeled by these guys.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like, what we're seeing today, and a lot of guys feel like they're falling short, if they're not willing to pull out a punch. They feel like they've failed as a man if some guy is making them look bad, if they're out at a party or a bar and some other guy, hypermasculine guy, has been making them look bad. A lot of guys slink away feeling like, I wish I would have hit him. I wish I would have hit him. I wish I would have hit him. This is what everybody else is doing. And they see that in the action hero movies. And since they were adolescents, they've seen it in video games. So, I mean, there really is a lot of pop culture consumption and messages of, this is what you do to have your man card stamped. And mm-hmm. I don't know what it's like, in Canada, but I can tell you in the States, there's a lot of body dysmorphia amongst younger guys. Mm-hmm. And that's not a coincidence. There are a lot of inflated torsos, huge upper bodies, guys spending a lot of time working out in the gym. And this is a way for them to feel that this is one way that they can get their man card stamped.
Yeah.
And so these are ways that I feel like I don't exactly call it progress for men. But there are a lot of ways that I feel like we are moving forward. There are movements, especially amongst younger men, to get involved in men's groups, which is fantastic. As you know, right? This is the hard work that you've been doing, which is fantastic, man.
Thank you.
There's that. Absolutely. There finally are commercials that are really kind of fun and lighthearted especially for men's products, men's care products, that are getting men
Yeah.
to kind of feel safe, right? With rethinking the way that they see themselves. And a lot of it speaks to things that a lot of these guys would watch it and say, hey, you know what? I've got those thoughts and feelings sometimes. So it's nice to see it reflected out there, because this isn't something I can talk about with my buddies, or I may not feel safe talking about it with my buddies. So, you know, and the fact that guys have more latitude in the ways, in their physical appearance, the ways that they can present themselves, younger guys. I think this is all really great ground that is moving in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to watch these, like, almost like tectonic plates rubbing up against each other, right? Because and to your point about, you know, Canadians versus Americans, I'd say we're exactly the same, just like without the guns. That's kind of like, that would be the big differentiator, right? Well, yeah, I mean, like, it's like we
that is no small
we don't
thing,
get
my
open
friend.
carry, so that's not like as much of a thing here. Like, gun violence is still an issue, but it's definitely not the same thing as in the U.S. My point being is that it's what's interesting is that these two plates are almost rubbing up against each other right now, and we're seeing these two counter movements where men are, you know, allowed to be more gender fluid than they've ever been. Men are spending more on personal care products than they ever have. You do have the Dev Men's Plus Care campaigns that are going out there that are really great. Axe Britain, I'll send you the link to it afterwards. You'll absolutely love this commercial. They've done a lot of work on this area, but it's really interesting to see these two plates rubbing up against each other. And it's funny because, like, at least in the case of, like, you know, heterosexual men and women have been saying for so long that they want guys to be more emotional, more in touch with their feelings. But what's interesting is that same culture that's impacting the men is also then programming the women to the point where it's like, and this is where we get the nice guys finish last thing, right? Where it's programmed all of us, right? And so it's like, that isn't what is wanted, not necessarily because it's not good and is what is needed, but because we've been so programmed with what a man should be. And you talked about the pithy punchlines and, you know, the maybe a little bit of a struggle with their inner compass. But the thing about that is that even if they struggle with the inner compass, they still figure it out themselves, by themselves, without having to go to another man and say, hey man, I'm really struggling. And that's the thing. It's like, when guys don't feel like they can do it themselves alone, and that's why we have such high incidences of alcoholism, drug abuse, and suicide in men, is because a lot of men would rather die to maintain their masculinity than to actually go out and say, I need support. And so from your perspective, like, so you're seeing these tectonic plates rubbing up against. So what is this new and evolving masculinity that you're starting to see? And do you have any thoughts on where this could kind of go and how we could evolve, like, in terms of, like, gender relationships in society?
Yeah, I mean, I do. And one thing I do want to say, you brought up a really important point that has to do with a lot of the women, you know, in men's lives who aren't always necessarily really okay with, you know, the emotional outpouring when guys get the green light to do it. And I'm not saying that a lot of women don't want it and don't support it, because thank God there are and they do. But there also are a lot of women out there that do feel really uncomfortable when a guy cries, and do feel really uncomfortable when a guy is sharing a little bit too much. You know, every semester in this course I teach called The Changing Face of Masculinity, it's mostly young women. And I'm not surprised at this point by that at all. And I always ask them, we get to the point, we talk about male vulnerability, and I'll say, you know, what are you comfortable with? What are you not comfortable with in the men in your lives? And especially if you are heterosexual with potential romantic partners. Eight times out of 10, and I've actually done questionnaires with this every semester, surveys, eight times out of 10, which is the average, they say that they're not okay with a guy crying in front of them. And they do not want a guy wanting to talk more about his feelings or his emotional struggles than they do. They much prefer being able to talk more than they want to be receiving. And so it's not that there's this ideal that a lot of women want this. Some women do. The ideal is still there, but in terms of women being able to really say, oh yeah, I do want this from you, as you know, I'll respond in kind as much as you're willing to share. I think there still is a disconnect there. And in my book, I talk about, you know, therapists who work with men who see this. And they'll say that the first time a guy shares, often the woman will be really responsive. And then if he keeps sharing and tries to keep going there, one of the things a lot of the therapists say they hear a lot is the female partners saying, I didn't realize you were this needy. So that's no small
Right.
thing. That's no small thing, because a lot of guys, a lot of younger guys especially, are getting to the point, which is great, where they feel like, I do need to kind of get this to the surface. In terms of Matt, in terms of the other thing you were saying, I think that you talk about the tension, or the kind of the pressure with these tectonic plates that are rubbing up against each other. In the research I was doing for the book, that was something I came across a lot. You know, where a lot of guys would say things like, I do have a friend. I have one or two really close friends, which in and of itself is very revealing. I have one or two close friends,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes I will go to them and I'll talk. And I'd say, okay, so what are the kind of things you guys are talking about? And almost always it was going to guy friends, and they'll very carefully vet what they'll share and what they won't. I call it targeted transparency. And the targeted transparency is always about problems they're having, and they're looking for solutions, or they're looking for advice.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So this is good. Guys are doing this, but what they're not doing is they're not going and saying, you know, I could just really use somebody just to listen to me. I could really use somebody to tell me, you know what, I don't even want solutions or advice. I just want somebody to tell me it's going to be okay. Or just to say, wow, you know what, that really sucks. This must be really hard for you. So many guys of all ages that I interviewed are still going to female friends and female partners. And so I feel like guys are making headway. But as you know from doing your work with Tether Men and being involved in men's groups, it's still the vast minority, right? In terms of getting in front of other guys and opening up, that's the gold standard, you know? But so I feel like a lot of guys are starting to talk a little bit with guys and opening up more about their problems, which for a lot of boys and young men and older men even is huge progress, because a lot of guys have never even done that.
Mm-hmm.
But this was very telling to me. To them, this was as far as they need to go. But what they weren't willing to get was reaching out and asking for emotional support. And the fact that what you see on Tether and what you see in the groups that you're with is how difficult it is for really sensitive, really thoughtful guys to have such a hard time opening up in the context of other men, even when they want to. What that speaks to is the next big hurdle that we need to get over, which is guys feeling safe in front of other guys. Because so much of the way that we're conditioned is about being competitive with each other. And one of the things that competition does on a very subtle level is it teaches guys that there's a form of trust we can give each other. I can come to you and I can get solutions, I can get advice. You may even have my back physically if I get into a fight. But we don't give each other emotional safety. And I feel like that's really the next big hurdle that we need to get over. That's what we need to get comfortable with, is boys and men learning to feel that they can trust each other. Because, you know, the idea of boys and men sitting in a room together and listening to each other and either just letting the other guy talk his truth or even giving him emotional support, that form of bearing witness is not something that we're used to giving each other. And that is really powerful. It's important that boys and men learn to do that in the presence of other boys and men, because it's extremely validating.
Mm-hmm. And you know, to your point, it's extremely validating, and it's something that we've never been trained to do, right? And that, I think, is the biggest thing, is that it's not that we lack the desire or lack the capacity. It's that we lack the training to be able to do it. And you're right. I mean, this is what, and your point about, you know, in relationships between men and women, right? So many women that I've spoken to have said, thank God, please, like, take my boyfriend, take my husband, take my son. Like, you know, he needs something like this. It's like, thank you, right? But it actually cuts deeper than that. And I think that there is uniquely something that men can provide from each other in terms of emotional support that cannot be provided cross gender. And they are those uniquely masculine things, the feeling of not enough manness, right? The needing to have your man card stamped. And this is also very much in the case of, you know, cisgendered men, right? Is that, you know, it's like having their man card stamped. And what's interesting too is, like, even with gay men that I speak to, this is not a heterosexual thing either, right? This is cutting across sexuality as well. This is not a straight guy issue. This is an all man issue, right? And what's so interesting is there is a unique type of support that we can provide each other. There is a unique type, because it's that ability to empathize. It's that ability to really be like, you know what, I have felt exactly that. And this is not to say that I think I have a number of female friends that I've gone to and spoke with, and I've worked with female therapists, and the ability to have that feminine energy hold space can be very, very healing. There is also something very unique and different about that coming from men. And that was what I found so transformative the first time I went on a men's group. And it's also taught me how to hold space for myself as well, which is really interesting, because that was something I was never able to do. And this is where men can't hold sadness for themselves, because they've never had another man hold sadness for them. They've never been taught how to hold sadness, right? And so what it ends up coming out as anger, frustration, or just downright depression, where it will literally chemically change the person's brain.
That's right. That's right. So Matt, let me ask you a question if I can.
Sure.
So one of the things in the men that I interviewed in my book, when they were, especially in men's groups, they did a great job of learning. And as you know, it takes a lot of work for most men to really get to the point where they can share in front of other men. And yet, as you know, that happens piecemeal. It happens piecemeal. But a lot of men spoke when I would ask them, so what does this look like beyond the closed doors of your men's group? A lot of men, and I appreciate their honesty, would say, well, basically, to be honest, it really kind of stops there, because this isn't something that I can do with other relationships. So I'm curious to hear what your experience is, if that's been the same thing with where a lot of men that you know who are doing the really noble, courageous work in men's groups, is it something that they can translate beyond, into public, beyond the closed doors of their group?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I would say that there are people in my life that are outside of the work that have been able to hold that space for me, and I've selected in my life those people very, very, very carefully. And you know, I'm also privileged to be able to work with people where, I mean, I've sort of intentionally fostered that culture of radical openness, honesty, and vulnerability, and that being okay. And that's something that I always hope to be a part of Tether. What I would say is that a lot of, it can kind of go one of two ways. Is they will have that really big opening experience, and then they just want to go and share it with everybody, and then it becomes an overshare, and they can kind of get a little bit hurt on that, because they're like, because the people in their life are just not ready for that, right? And you do move up a level of consciousness when you have those types of experiences, and when you start to unwind a lot of that societal programming. So I would say I felt more squarely into that camp, and my own willingness to sort of go out and share and just throw it all out there is also part of the reason why I decided to start a company around it, because that's kind of like the most extreme case of that happening. What I would say for other men is that I think it can become progressive. And so one of the big things that I want to do with Tether is actually, by doing this work with each other, we're learning to trust each other with these things. And what I know has happened is that I have had friends who have come to me and said, you know, because of what you've done, or because of, you know, something that I heard you say, right? I was able to have a conversation with somebody in my life that I've never been able to have before. And that means a
That's
tremendous
huge.
amount to me,
That's
right? It's huge.
huge.
It's
Yeah.
massive, right? And that is so validating in and of itself. And then, seeing guys go from being, actively suicidal on our platform, to being able to express gratitude to the support in the community, just
Wow.
simply because they were allowed to hold space with men that were emotionally supportive. Now, what I think is happening, and we need to be responsible for this just as much as women. Like, this is a back and forth thing, and also it's a man to man thing. Is we need to start to train each other on how to communicate. I think this really just comes down to, how do you communicate emotions with people? And I think it's just that a lot of people don't have that capacity to be emotionally literate and hold space. And I think it really does. And I hate that I'm talking now a little bit long, but I want to finish this one thought. I really do believe that it comes down to the fact that we have these things called mirror neurons in our brain, right? And so when we see somebody having an emotion, sadness, anxiety, whatever, our brains it's the same reason why we cry at a scary movie. We are literally, those emotions are being triggered within us. And so we get
Right.
uncomfortable because we don't like the feeling of sadness or anxiety. And so we try and shut it down. And that's why it's like, when people say, oh, I'm so anxious and so sad, it's like, well, have you tried working out a little bit more or becoming a vegan, right? Like, that is a way to like push that thing aside, to shut it down, right? It's like, if I can just get them to work out and change their diet, then I don't have to hear about this. And thank God for that. It's so much
Yeah, right.
harder for us to actually sit with someone and say, that sounds really tough, and to actually be in our bodies, to feel it, to know that that's not ours. That takes an added level of awareness. So I think we are getting there, and there's a lot of organizations that are doing this type of work right now. But I think it is slow progress, but we are starting to see those barriers come down, I would say, over time. I don't know if you agree with this, but like, this is kind of the way that I've been feeling about how it has to
Yeah.
be an incremental, and it's us teaching each other almost how to treat each other on a very
I know.
basic
No,
level.
I completely agree with that. And I would also add to that, Matt, that, we live in an age of I think decreasing a willingness to be vulnerable. Not that we've ever been in like a Garden of Eden of vulnerability in any culture,
Mm-hmm.
but, for instance, if you look back at, 20, 30 years ago, there was a greater degree of, I think, vulnerability amongst people. I think as our societies have become more much more hyper competitive on many levels, social media just exacerbates that.
Mm-hmm.
It's true for men and it's true for women. I talk about this a lot with my students. There is much less of a willingness, online and offline, even offline, to feel like you can be vulnerable. And so that is going to make it much, much harder, for both men and women, to feel that they can be that with another person. With men, and this is what I was talking about before about this backslide, I think that
Mm-hmm.
lack of vulnerability that a lot of men see is, and a lot of them are taught that they can't show, is not just like a hyper masculine thing. A lot of it is, but part of it is very cultural. We live in a time of very much being armored, and women, you
Mm-hmm.
talk with women, they feel the same way. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's going to make it a lot harder. And that's where that you talk about the tectonic plates coming up against each other. It makes it really confusing for guys too, especially for guys, because they've got so many messages telling them not to be this way. And then they've got some messages from people like yourself and from me and from some of the pop culture that are finally telling them this is what you need. If you want to chip away at this isolation, if you want to chip away at this anxiety and depression, if you want to prevent suicidal ideation, you need to let this stuff see light of day. You need to let it percolate up. You need to know how to access it, how to process it. And so I feel like what often happens with men is when the rug is pulled out beneath of them and there's existential urgency, that's when they're
Mm-hmm.
willing to finally do something. And I feel like unfortunately, that's what's happening, is that there's as you said earlier, the isolation, the horrible suicide spikes, these are all things that are putting a lot of young men and middle-aged men in a place where they're saying, I've got to do something. And that's what it takes. And you know what? If that's what it takes for them to start to like hear the messages that we're really, you know, that we're preaching here, then that's okay. Because it takes this.
Well, and it kind of goes away along too with the way that men versus women deal with even their physical health. Like women are far more willing to do preventative care than men are. Men are very reactive, right? It's like they don't do something until they have a problem, right? That needs to be solved, right? Otherwise, they just throw it to the side, right? And I think that, I mean, that in and of itself, I wouldn't say, you know, there are, you know, people on both sides that, you know, you know, are reactive, but it's much more of a male quality to be reactive towards health as opposed to preventative. And I think also we're now living, especially we're seeing a light shone on that even more, you know, with, you know, certain leaders around the world, and also with, you know, COVID boxing us all into this really tiny space where we're now cut off from even having these conversations. And I really do believe that there is a waking up and enlightening that we are being forced through. And part of the pain of what so many people are feeling right now, me included, and I'm deep in this work. Like I do this work, you know, this is my livelihood, this is my day, right? And I still find it difficult. Like I still get on calls with, you know, a coach or a therapist or whatever, because I'm still working through a lot of these feelings and normalizing these feelings with my body.
That's great.
And I think, yeah, and we all need to be doing, but like COVID is really also shining a light on the isolation that we're feeling. And you mentioned that before, right? That idea, it's like once we started to leave the family farm, we left this nuclear community that now we started to deal with, you know, identities of purpose and crisis and all of these things in our lives that previously weren't there when we were just in this safer community. It's a really interesting time and a really interesting arc that's happening right now. And it's like we're all being forced through like the narrow end of this canal basically right now. And I don't know how it's going to turn out on the other end, but yeah, it's just we're all being pushed through this really small hole.
We are, and that's right. And you know, coronavirus really has been a mirror. It's been a very well focused mirror for not just everybody, but especially I think for boys and men. I really do. And because of the way that we have been allowed, you know, to really just push everything under the rug and to just hold off as long as possible. But in this kind of isolation on so many levels, it's just, you know, the dam is bursting for a lot of boys and men. And that's why this is such a sharp mirror back on the isolation for boys and men. It really has been.
And so, like from your perspective, like without giving away the like kind of the punchline of the book. And by the way, if you're still on this or you're watching this in the future, we're on with Andrew Reiner. He's the author of Better Boys, Better Men. This is going to be coming out when, by the way?
December 1st.
December 1st. Okay. Stocking stuffer. I'm expecting my copy. I know it's coming to my door at any moment now, right? But like in terms of like where's the puck going, and what do you see? Like, because I sort of talked, you know, about, you know, where like after the men's room door closes, you know, and real life starts to begin. But then even more so from a societal perspective, like where is all of this going? And what do you sort of see as the evolution of what you're going through? Does the old way win, or does the new way, you know, win?
Yeah, I mean that's the big question, isn't it? That really is the big question. I think that what's going to happen for a lot of men, young men and middle-aged men, but especially for younger men, I think that, you know, this reckoning that they're dealing with in the isolation, I think that they're not going to be able to, I think they're going to come out of something like this pandemic and they're not going to be able to go back to business as usual. Because I think there's just going to be too much at the surface for too many men, and in terms of they're only going to be able to suppress so much. And I think that one of the things that this pandemic is teaching a lot of us, especially boys and men really, not boys, is that we're going into dangerous places with drinking, with alcohol abuse especially, and I'm sure with other kinds of substance abuse. But there's a lot of young men I've been speaking with recently that have talked about that it's just been so easy to slip into even more dangerous patterns of drinking, and they don't want to go there, and that's a great sign. So I think that what's going to happen is, we're going to come out of this, and there's going to be a reckoning. And I'm not saying everybody's going to flood into therapist's office and men's groups, which you and I wish would happen. But I think what's going to happen is a lot of this is going to be a kind of pearl, a grain of sand under the oyster. It's going to be this irritant that's not going to go away. It's not going to go away. There's going to be an irritant, because this has been a very existential crisis for all of us. And so we're not going to come out of this suddenly just picking up where we left off. And I think for a lot of people, especially for men, there's going to be this irritant that is going to keep them awake at night. That is just, they're not going to be able to shake like they've been able to shake in the past. And I think in some ways, ironically, for a lot of them, it could be what saves them in terms of seeking the help they need.
That's incredible. And I think that's a beautiful
I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful, Matt. I'm hopeful,
Listen, I like your optimism. Like, I do believe there's going to be a natural evolution of consciousness, and unfortunately it's going to take some of us. And I think for some of us, you're right, it is going to be the thing that finally pushes over the edge to getting the help we need. So. And I know you're going to be there on the front lines. I know us at Tether, we're going to be on the front lines for that. That's, why we're here. And so thank you so much for doing this with us, Andrew. This has been a wonderful hour of my time. I mean, this is a subject I love riffing on. So thank you. Thank you for making this so much fun.
Hey, it's been great. It's been a pleasure, Matt. Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
Wonderful. And have a wonderful evening. And your son's a lucky boy.
Well, thank you. That means a lot. That really does. Thank you very much.
And I wish
be well. Take good care of yourself. Thank you, Matt.
Wonderful. Have a great evening. And thanks for everyone who joined. This is another edition of Tether Talks. We have Andrew Reiner, author of Better Boys, Better Men. Pick it up on December 1st.
Be well.